Hello and welcome to Weighed in the Balance, the show where we examine to see if claims can hold up to scrutiny. Happy Reformation Week. For those of you that do not know, this Friday, October 31st, though some of you may know it as All Hallows Eve, and that gets shortened in English to Halloween, the Eve of All Saints, which is November 1st. Some of you may know it as that, but those of us who love the Reformation and the recovery of the gospel that it was know that October 31st is Reformation Day. And since this is the week where we celebrate the Reformation, my own congregation celebrated the Reformation yesterday in our Sunday service. We did that by singing hymns like A Mighty Fortress is Our God, by reading together Psalm 46, which A Mighty Fortress is based on. We also sang another hymn written by Martin Luther. We love the Reformation. And so we actually will take the time to celebrate and give thanks for the fact that a very imperfect man, a man who certainly had his flaws and a man that we do not follow in all things, nevertheless, he was able to teach us much about the gospel, and that is a good thing. And so, since this is the week where we celebrate that, I wanted to do a video on 5 misconceptions about the Reformation. If you go looking for videos on the Reformation on YouTube, you will, well, it won't take you long to find many videos from the Protestant perspective that give you information that is not correct, and it won't take you long to find videos from the Roman Catholic perspective who give you information that is not correct. For example, you might find videos from the Protestant perspective that say the 95 Theses were Luther's problems with the Roman Catholic Church. That's actually not true. But likewise, you might find from the Roman Catholic perspective people saying, well, Luther thought you could just do whatever you want because Jesus died for you. Well, that is not true either, right? So there are all kinds of misconceptions about the Reformation. And so these are the first 5 that came to my mind. So misconception number 1 is that the Reformation happened on October 31st, 1517. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, Pastor, I thought you said October 31st was Reformation Day. Well, it is. That's the day that we have chosen to recognize and to set aside and celebrate as the day of the Reformation. October 31st, 1517 was not when the Reformation happened. In fact, Martin Luther was not even himself a Lutheran at the time. That word would have made no sense. If you read the 95 Theses, you will find Luther saying many Roman Catholic things, talking about being in submission to Christ's vicar, the priest, talking about how if you deny the legitimacy of indulgences, then may you be anathema, right? The 95 Theses were not Luther, putting the church on notice that these things were wrong, and here's my issues with you, and you better change this. Like, the 95 Theses were Luther posting 95 debate theses that he wanted to debate. That's it. He had seen the sale of indulgences. He had seen how this was attacking primarily the poor, and he thought that that practice of selling indulgences was wrong. But at that time, he didn't even have a problem with the practice of indulgences, only the sale of them. And so to say that the Reformation happened on October 31st, 1517 is absolutely incorrect. And you can go find videos with myself and Pastor Matt Dorowski where we talk about that, where we say, look, Luther was still developing his views in 1517. And the Luther of 1517 is not the same as the Luther of 1521, only 4 years later. Luther had not at that time had what he described as his mountaintop experience, where he is reading through the book of Romans and he sees, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And that was so incredibly strange to him, because why would the gospel be seen as something that was good? The gospel was all of these requirements that Luther wasn't living up to. But then he read verse 17 and saw, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, or from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And Luther's study of Romans, coupled with his study of the Psalms, he began to see this picture of the gospel that had, well, been hidden from him in the medieval Roman Catholic Church. And he began to see, it is not a matter of what we do in order to merit our salvation, but it is the great exchange where Christ gives his righteousness to us and our sin is placed on him. That had not happened in 1517. That happened between 1517 and 1521. In 1521, at the Diet of Worms, Luther is a Lutheran, even though that word still wouldn't have made any sense to him. Nevertheless, he was soteriologically Protestant. He was holding to justification by faith alone. In 1517, he was not. And so when you find videos that have actually, there's one guy on YouTube who I'm going to interact with his stuff, just haven't yet. Stay tuned for that. What is his name? Hold on, I'll tell you his name in a second. Sean Hiller, that's his name. So Sean Hiller has made quite a few videos lately talking about how they don't want you to read the 95 Theses, and the 95 Theses prove the Catholic position. I don't know what he means by we don't want you to read the 95 Theses. Of course, the 95 Theses were written from a Roman Catholic perspective because Luther was, at the time, still a Roman Catholic because the Reformation did not happen on October 31st, 1517. In fact, the Reformation didn't happen on one day. It was a process throughout Luther's life and other people's lives, because misconception number 2 is that Luther was the only figure of the Reformation, or that somehow Luther accomplished the Reformation, or that Luther was the singular figure. In reality, Luther was a very important figure, and even you could probably say the most important because he was the most famous. But when you look at the Protestant Reformation, take for example the Book of Concord, which is the confessional documents of the Lutheran Church. In that you will find that Luther is the author of the Small Catechism and the Large Catechism and I believe the Smalcald Articles, and that's it. So, the Augsburg Confession was written by Philip Melanchthon. The Apology to the Augsburg Confession was written by Philip Melanchthon. The Treatise on the Power and Primacy of the Pope was written by Philip Melanchthon. And go listen to the audio-only feed if you want to learn more about Philip Melanchthon. The Formula of Concord, both the Epitome and the Solid Declaration, those were written primarily by a guy named Martin Chemnitz a generation later. So even in Lutheranism, there are more documents written not by Martin Luther than there are documents written by Martin Luther. But even so, at the time when Luther was nailing his theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, down in Zurich, in Switzerland, there was another Reformation happening in parallel, which had a completely different origin point, because there was a guy named Ulrich Zwingli who decided to start preaching verse by verse through books of the Bible, starting in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, and preaching through the New Testament. And he came to his own Reformation conclusions entirely independent of Luther. Now, they did try to have a rapprochement, a colloquy, and this happened at Marburg Castle. It's gone down in history as the Marburg Colloquy, where they agreed on all points of doctrine but one, and that was the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. Now, some people will say that Zwingli had a mere memorialist view. Some people will say Zwingli had a view more similar to John Calvin's view, where Christ is spiritually present but not physically present. You can go and try to hash that out for yourself. The point is, the Lutherans, and especially Martin Luther, were not going to settle for anything less than real physical presence, and so they were unable to come together on that point. But in the Reformed Reformation, which didn't even originate with Luther, you have Zwingli, Bullinger, Butzer, Oecolampadius, Calvin, Beza, Debray, Ursinus, Olivianus. There are so many names in the Reformation that are not Martin Luther, that even if someone can attack Martin Luther's character and absolutely portray him as a crazed, villainous rogue in church history, even if you remove Martin Luther, Lutheranism can still stand, and Reformed Christianity can still stand without the writings of Martin Luther. To put it another way, we can say that Luther was right about justification by faith alone, and in my own tradition say we're not even really dependent on him for that. We use him. His writings are very useful in giving that understanding, but so is, even if we wanted to go to a Lutheran source for that, we could go to Philip Melanchthon. Now you could say, well, wasn't Philip Melanchthon dependent on Luther? Perhaps. But if you're going to say that the entire Reformation stands and falls on Martin Luther the man, well, from a Roman Catholic perspective, when someone makes that accusation against Leo, for example, say tomorrow it came out that Leo had some horrible moral scandal, would you say that the Roman Catholic Church had been disproven because Leo was shown to be a sinner? Of course not. In fact, there are many popes in the medieval period that you absolutely could point to and say that man was unworthy of any office in the church. And the Roman Catholic response is, well, yes, but it's not dependent on that one man. In the same way, the Reformation is not dependent on Luther himself, even though we are greatly indebted to him for his insights, even though he was the most famous figure in the Reformation, even though I think he is many times misunderstood by those on the Roman Catholic side. Nevertheless, he was not the sole figure in the Reformation, and there are many voices that are equally worth hearing, even if Luther is the most famous. The third misconception about the Reformation is that the goal of the Reformation was to break away from Rome, to start a new church, that when Luther goes and nails his theses, not only do people often think that at that time he was a Protestant, he wasn't, but also the thinking is that the goal was to break with the Roman Catholic Church and found a new church. And you'll see this in people on Instagram, on YouTube, places like that, who will say, well, Jesus founded the Roman Catholic Church. They won't say Roman Catholic, they'll just say Catholic. But they'll say, Jesus founded my church, Martin Luther founded your church. Well, that would only be true if Luther was seeking to found a new church. And that's just not true. On October 31st, 1517, Luther was not wanting to found a new church. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, Luther is still not wanting to found a new church, even though by that point he has been excommunicated in the papal bull Exsurge Domine. That's right, Luther never actually broke with the Roman Catholic Church. Leo X excommunicated Martin Luther. And this is true of all the reformers by and large. They were not seeking to found a new church. They all acknowledged that there is one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. The Reformation was an attempt to reform the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. And the only way that you can see it as a revolution or a breaking away is if you say, in order to be in the one holy Catholic and apostolic church, you must be in submission to the Bishop of Rome. And that's actually one of the points that is under dispute. There are many Protestants who will concede that, and my church isn't one of them, but nevertheless, there are Protestants who will concede that, look, the Bishop of Rome was a valid office. It simply sought for itself prerogatives and authorities that it had no right to. In my own tradition, we would say that the Bishop of Rome was not a valid office because we reject the validity of the episcopacy. Nevertheless, we would say that you can have a faulty ecclesiology and still be a true church, because the marks of the church are the word rightly preached, the sacraments rightly administered, and discipline rightly enforced. And so you can be deficient in ecclesiology and still be a true church. You can also, our confession of faith says that the purest churches under heaven are subject to mixture and error. And so when we look at our own heritage, we see, especially in the Middle Ages, there's a lot of mixture and error. There's a lot of that is wrong, but, and this is the very important part, we're not Mormons. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints teaches that the church ceased to exist, that Jesus founded the church and that they believed LDS doctrine, but then the church disappeared and it had to be restored. The Reformation was not seeking to restore the church. The Reformation was not even seeking to break with Rome and start a new church. The Reformation was seeking to reform the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And so for John Calvin, he would have said, well, as this one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is present here in Geneva, we are going to reform it along these lines. Luther, as the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is present here in Wittenberg and in Saxony generally, and in the other principalities and duchies and stuff like that where the princes accepted Lutheranism, as the one Catholic Church is present in these areas, we are going to reform it along these lines. But to say that the Reformation was a revolution because it became a revolution when the Protestants broke away, well, that was never their intention, and it was the Pope who actually was handing out excommunications. Now, you can say, I suppose, from the Roman Catholic perspective, that those excommunications were warranted, but it is a misconception to say that breaking away was the goal. Fourth misconception is that Henry VIII had anything to do with the Reformation, even the Reformation in England. Now, some of you are going to hear me say that and say, what on earth are you talking about? The Church of England was founded because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. Well, yes, and also no. First, let's talk about the Roman myth of the Roman Catholic Church standing up for the sanctity of marriage in the saga of Henry VIII. The reality is that the Roman Catholic Church was completely fine granting annulments to powerful people. Granting annulments even when the marriages in question had produced children, thus declaring that all of those children were illegitimate. And there actually is a not in good taste word that is what it would make those children. And I know that that's very uncomfortable, but that is what they would do. They would declare a marriage null and void, and therefore all children that were produced in that marriage that after many years had been declared null and void, well, they now become illegitimate children. That is what Henry wanted. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to be declared null and void. So that is also a misconception under the misconception, is that Henry wanted a divorce. No, Henry wanted what kings often got. Now, it was still wrong. He'd been married to her for over a decade. They had had, I think, 2 children together, one that lived. They might have had more. I know they had a son who either was stillborn or died in infancy, and then there was Mary, the future Queen Mary Tudor. But regardless, they had been married for over a decade. They had multiple children together, even if only one lived past infancy. And yet Henry wanted an annulment on the basis that Catherine had been married to his older brother before he died, and then he pulled a verse out of context from the law of Moses that said that if you sleep with your brother's wife, then you'll die childless. Leaving aside the fact that in the Old Testament law, actually it was the duty of a brother, if your brother died and had no children, it was actually your duty to marry his wife and take care of her and also have children with her. So he was wrong in just about every way you could be asking for this annulment, but he was asking for what kings often got from the Roman Catholic Church at the time. So why didn't Henry get it? Is it because, no, he had a lawful wife and the institution of marriage is so sacred that we could never grant this annulment? No. The reason he did not receive the annulment that he wanted is because Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. You might have heard of them. In 1492, they hired this guy to sail the ocean blue. The family from which she came was incredibly powerful. Her nephew was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. So Catherine was actually in a position where she could say, no, I'm not going to stand for this. I have political clout too. It's not just you as the king who can do whatever you want. I actually can call on my rich and powerful friends to stop this. And that's what she did. That Catherine's familial connections were more powerful than Henry's, because at the time, England is just some backwater. Right? Who was actually the movers and shakers in Europe at the time? Well, there were the Habsburgs. There was Francis, the King of France. I forget the name of that royal house. But those were the big players in European politics at the time, was Charles I and Francis. I believe Francis I, King of France. And you even see this in the early 1600s when the Synod of Dort is called, where the English delegates to the Synod of Dort and the French delegates actually have an argument over who gets to sit in the best seats. Because the English delegates said, well, King James I of England is the greatest Protestant monarch in Europe. And the French delegates' response was, yes, but the King of France is the greatest monarch in Europe. Because England was not the superpower that it would later become. And so in the 1500s, in the early 1500s, when Henry is wanting this annulment, Catherine was able to use her influence to keep the annulment from being granted. Now, that being said, Henry did eventually break with Rome in order to get his annulment, but it was decidedly not for theological reasons. It was so he could get the annulment. And actually, even the Protestant reformers who were trying to work in the Church of England at the time, they did not find Henry to be an ally by and large. They sometimes found him agreeable to going along with what they suggested, but as often as not, it was the Lutherans or the Protestants within the Church of England that were the objects of Henry's ire. That was as common as the Roman Catholics. So yes, Thomas More was executed because he opposed the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine. Thomas Cromwell was executed because he kept pushing Lutheran ideas and actually, in pursuit of that, had pushed Henry into a marriage that Henry didn't like with a woman named Anne of Cleves. And that's actually a very interesting episode if you want to look into it. She was a German princess and came from a Lutheran royal house there in what is now Germany. And when Henry meets her, there is this ritual where she's supposed to, Henry is in disguise in this crowd, and she's supposed to go through the crowd. And because Henry is her one true love, she can find him. Well, she didn't know what the custom was. She hadn't been adequately prepared. And then Henry himself, by this point, was morbidly obese and had a wound from a jousting accident that actually never healed. And it was constantly pussing and it stunk, and he was not a very attractive or desirable person at this time. And so she's already confused by the customs, and then this guy who's really not desirable, I'm trying to say this in a nice way, this man to whom she was not attracted at all starts approaching her and doesn't even say who he is or why he's doing this or what's going on, and she reacted very negatively. I think, because later Henry will talk about just how ugly she is. He actually said that she looked like a horse. I think it's just as likely that Henry was insulted that she wasn't attracted to him. Because then when he starts asking for an annulment of that marriage, she doesn't fight it. She goes, fine, whatever. Yes, our marriage is null and void. I will live here in England and live out my days. I will be happy to be called the king's beloved sister. That's fine. And so it's just such an interesting episode where, by all accounts, she didn't like him, and he was offended that she didn't like him, and that's why he wanted the annulment. But Thomas Cromwell had arranged that marriage in order to secure an alliance with Lutheran princes to move Henry in the direction of Lutheran theology, and Henry chopped his head off for it. Henry ends up, oh goodness, was it the 6 articles or was it the 9 articles? Let me look that up. Hold on. It was 6. It was the 6 articles of religion. The Protestants referred to it as a whip with 6 bloody tails because he was affirming things like transubstantiation. He was refusing to allow priests to marry. And actually, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Thomas Cranmer, actually had to send his wife away because he wasn't going to divorce her or have that marriage declared null and void. But he also couldn't have her stick around because it was illegal. And in everything, the 6 articles of religion were Roman Catholic in their theology, but Henry was still not in the good graces of the Roman Catholic Church. But nevertheless, his theology, he didn't like submitting to the Pope, but his theology in its entirety was Roman Catholic. And so within that Church of England, you did have reformers like Cranmer, like Latimer and Ridley and other people like that, working within the Church of England, but they were as often as not working against Henry as they were working with Henry or for Henry. So that is a major misconception that people will say, well, the Protestant Reformation, I mean, look, it was in certain places, it was... its sole purpose was to allow a man to divorce his lawful wife, and the Church of Rome was standing up for marriage. And basically every part of that is false. The final misconception, and this is probably the most important one to get right, the final misconception about the Reformation is that it was a difference between salvation by grace on the Protestant side and salvation by works on the Roman Catholic side. The difference was more subtle than that, but no less important. So the difference was not salvation by grace versus salvation by works. The difference was salvation by grace alone and salvation by grace plus works, right? Justification by faith alone or justification by faith plus works. You see how it's inaccurate to say that Roman Catholics don't believe in salvation by grace. They just don't believe in grace alone. It is likewise inaccurate to say that they don't believe in justification by faith. It's just not by faith alone. Equally important from the Roman Catholic perspective is that it is not that works are nowhere present in the life of the Christian, or that the Christian is not called upon by Scripture to perform good works and walk in the ways of Christ. The sticking point for us is salvation, right standing before God, being declared righteous before God, is on the basis of what Christ has done and faith in it, and by His grace that He gives to us alone, and not because of our merits. It is not the case that once we are in Christ, once we are brought into a right standing with God, that there is no place for works. It is what is the basis of our right standing before God. Because ultimately, when you have a faith plus works salvation, though it is inaccurate to say that it is salvation by works, because then you're saying that faith has no element in it, or that it is salvation by works because grace has no element in it, it's not the case that grace is not there. It's just what's the difference between someone who is saved and someone who is not. Is it God's grace? Well, no, because both can be given God's grace and yet still perish. The difference would be one's own works. And so that's why it gets portrayed as salvation by grace versus salvation by works, and it's more subtle than that. The reason why that misconception can happen is because the difference maker is still the works. But as a Protestant, don't be fooled by that, well, we don't believe in salvation by works. No, salvation is by God's grace. Because when you look into the system, God's grace brings you into a state where your works will be honored as meritorious. It's called congruent merit. And so it is important to have those distinctions so that you are not led astray. And for the Roman Catholic side, it is important to acknowledge that we are not saying that a Christian can just do whatever he wants. Perhaps some once saved, always saved people might go that far. Even they would not be comfortable with that way of putting it. The difference is salvation by grace alone through faith alone, or salvation by grace through faith plus works. Now, those are my 5 misconceptions. Let me know in the comments what you think, and if you think that there are some other misconceptions that I should address. I'm planning on uploading this on Tuesday, so we'll have several more days in the week where we can talk about some more misconceptions. I would love to hear what you all think about that and misconceptions you think that I should address. If you haven't yet, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more content. I thank you once again so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.